Sameach to Samach. What a great song from Rabbi Baruch Chait from his Kol Salonik, the Voice of Salonik album. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday night. Let's light up the darkness. Very fun page of Talmud we're going to be covering today. 2 Mishnas we'll be involved with. Can you do chalitzah at night? And is spitting an indispensable component of the chalitzah ceremony? Who's with us on a Sunday night? Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Tom in Pennsylvania, Bill in Mid-Missouri, John in Maine, Paula in the Great Northwest, Heather in Kansas, Sharon in New Jersey, Nancy, North Carolina, Tom in PA, Sharon. Tonight is my husband's yard site. He died 53 years ago. Ironically, also on Father's Day. Oh, Sharon, may his memory always be for a blessing. And may our learning tonight accrue to his merit. Let's learn tonight in honor of your late husband on his yard site. And may all this learning accrue to his merit and lift him even a little higher in the world of souls. We say amen. Ryan in Jacksonville, Florida. Karen in Northern California. Aoife in Florida. Happy Father's Day, everyone. I hope you're having a special one if you're celebrating it. Okay. Page 104. Here in Tractate Yevamos, these are the laws of levirate marriage, the 14th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 12. There are 122 pages in this tractate. We're on 104. Tonight we pick it up with Mishna number 2. This chapter 12 is about the details of chalitzah, the ceremony by which a Yavam, a surviving brother of a man who died married but without a child, who leaves a widow. So the surviving brother and the widow have an obligation to each other to get married, and their first child will be an inheritor to the man who died, or they can decline to perform that mitzvah and perform an alternative mitzvah, the ceremony of chalitzah, which is described in the Torah as a ceremony in which the woman, the widow, removes the shoe of her brother-in-law publicly in front of 3 judges, as we've seen. She has to remove the shoe. She has to recite lines from the Torah. So shall be done to the man who refuses to build up his brother's house. And as we'll be talking about tonight, she spits in his presence. Is that an indispensable part of the ceremony? First, we open with a question in Mishnah number 2. Can the chalitzah ceremony be performed at night? A good question. Can it be performed at night? Mishnah number 2 on page 104a. If a woman performed chalitzah at night, her chalitzah is valid. But Rabbi Elazar invalidates it. If she performed chalitzah on the left foot, her chalitzah is invalid. But Rabbi Elazar validates it. Does she need to pull the shoe off the Yavam when it's his right foot? The last few nights we were talking about what is a shoe, what constitutes a shoe, what are the minimum requirements of a shoe so that it can be called a shoe, like covering the foot, covering the heel, being made of a substantial material like leather, etc. What is removal? What is the foot from which the shoe must be removed? All those questions we covered in the last few days and pertinent to Mishnah number 1. Okay, now we have this controversy at the level of the Mishnah between those who say that a Mishnah performed at night is valid and Rabbi Elazar who doesn't, and those who say, the majority, that the chalitzah must be performed on the right foot But Rabbi Elazar validates, right? So he invalidates the chalitzah that is performed at night, but he validates chalitzah performed on the left foot. So he's stringent in one question and lenient on the other. Now the Gemara. Let us say that they, the rabbis and Rabbi Elazar who disagree in this Mishnah, let us say that they disagree about the following issue. One sage, the minority, Rabbi Elazar, holds that we compare the laws governing monetary disputes, right? Monetary civil disputes that come before a rabbinic court, which category includes chalitzah, as chalitzah carries with it monetary ramifications. We've only been talking about the fact that a woman becomes free to go marry another member of the public and no longer has an obligation to marry her brother-in-law when she performs chalitzah. But there's also monetary implications of this. Who is going to be the inheritor? Does she have to be supported by the first husband's estate? Other questions that are related. So, let us say that one sage, Rabbi Elazar, holds that we compare the laws of chalitzah to the laws governing monetary dispute, and generally speaking, the laws of monetary disputes, that we compare chalitzah as a subset of the broader category, monetary disputes, and that we compare this broader category, monetary disputes, to the law of tzuras, right? Tzuras. The one who becomes a mitzora, who has that outbreak on his skin. This doesn't exist anymore. But when the nation of Israel was living at a more exalted spiritual level in the Holy Land with the temple standing, if people perform certain transgressions, particularly speaking gossip, lashon hara, eventually they could have this outbreak of the skin and become a mitzora. And here we're learning that for some reason the laws of tzuras, which could happen not only to a person, but to a garment, as we saw yesterday, or to a house, and that somehow this body of law of when people are deemed impure and they can transmit impurity, or a garment needs to be destroyed, or a house needs to be destroyed because of the tzuras, that body of law is somehow comparable to the body of law of monetary disputes. How? Just as tzuras cases are judged only during the day, meaning during daylight, likewise, monetary cases may take place only during daylight. And the other sage, meaning the anonymous Tana of our Mishnah, with whom the majority agrees, that's why he's anonymous, and the other sage holds that we do not compare monetary disputes with tzuras, and therefore tzuras needs to be judged during the day, but monetary disputes do not need to be judged during the daylight hours. And the Gemara responds, no, actually everyone holds that we do not compare monetary disputes with tzuras, for if we would compare them fully, then even delivering the verdict of the court case could not be done at night. But it is permitted to complete monetary judgments and deliver the verdict at night, provided that proceedings began during the day. If there was a long civil case involving the awarding of damages in a monetary suit, it has to be done mostly during the day. But if they went over into the night, then the verdict could be given at night. And presumably with the law of tzuras, it all has to be done during the day. But here, with respect to performing chalitzah at night, what they disagree about is this. One sage, Rabbi Elazar, holds that chalitzah is considered like the beginning of judgment in monetary cases, so it would have to be done during the day. And the other sage, the first Tana, holds that chalitzah is considered like the verdict of monetary judgment, and therefore it may also be conducted at night. Seems like Rabbi Elazar says it has to be during the day. The other sages say it can be done at night. What is their reasoning for this? Because they're comparing it. One is comparing it to the beginning of monetary cases, and the other is comparing it to any portion of monetary cases. So it could be happening during the day or the night. It is told that Rabbi Bar Chia Ketosfa from Satisphon conducted chalitzah using a slipper that was not made of leather. Now, we've heard that's no good. If a shoe's not made of leather, it better be quite sturdy in some way and support and protect and surround the foot. And a slipper, I think we already heard specifically that a slipper does not qualify as a shoe that is removed during chalitzah. And if one did so, perhaps after the fact, it might be allowed, but certainly not ab initio, and maybe not even after the fact. So here was told that Rabbi Bar Chia Ketosfa from Ctesiphon conducted chalitzah using a slipper that was not made of leather. And not only that, he did so in private, as he was the only judge. Wait, he didn't even have, not only did he not have 3 judges, he didn't have 2 judges. That was 1 judge. And he did it at night. So it would seem to have 3 strikes against it. Shmuel said disparagingly, how great is the power of this master who follows an individual opinion? As in his practice, he relied on individual opinions that are not accepted as law. It would seem that he took some real liberties in allowing this chalitzah in front of 1 judge with only a slipper not made of leather and at night. So the question is, are all 3 of those elements problematic or just 2 of them? It is told, so the Gemara asks, what is difficult for Shmuel about Rabba bar Chiya's actions? Okay, it would seem like, well, Shmuel has a problem that he did it alone with only 1 judge. He did it without a leather shoe, and he did it at night. So, what is difficult for Shmuel? If it was the fact that he conducted chalitzah using a slipper, well, there is an unattributed opinion taught in a baraisa stating that it is valid. Right? So there actually is an anonymous Mishna, meaning it's a majority opinion, that says you can use a slipper. All right. As the opinion is unattributed, this indicates that it is not the view of a single individual, but rather the opinion of the majority. If it was the fact that he performed chalitzah at night, well, here in our Mishnah, we have an unattributed opinion taught that you can perform chalitzah at night. So rather, what was difficult for him was that Rabbi bar Chiya conducted chalitzah in private as the sole judge. Now, how could he do so in private? As that is taught only in accordance with the opinion of in accordance with an individual opinion. We have no anonymous majority opinion anywhere that says a sole judge can preside over a chalitzah rather than a panel of 3. So how could Rabbi bar Chiya do this? So it's only in accordance with an individual opinion. As we learned in a Mishnah, if she performed chalitzah before 2 or 3 judges, and one of them is found to be a relative or disqualified, so her chalitzah is invalid because there was only 1 valid judge. And Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan, the cobbler, validate the judge who is not a relative or disqualified. So they would say that, okay, 1 judge, so if there were 2 judges and 1 was disqualified, the other judge is enough and it's a valid chalitzah, at least after the fact. But that's not a majority opinion. It's only the opinion of 2 people, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan the cobbler. If there are 2 judges who are not relatives, then they hold that the chalitzah is valid, as they validated chalitzah performed before 2 judges. And an incident occurred involving one who performed chalitzah between him and her alone in prison, as there was no judge present at all. And the incident came before Rabbi Akiva, and he validated it. So there was no judge. So you would say, well, maybe Rabbi bar Chiya could point to this opinion, this instance where there was an exigency, there was a need, exigent circumstances, where there was no judge at all, but this man and woman were alone in prison. If they weren't allowed, if they didn't recognize their own chalitzah, they couldn't perform chalitzah, and they needed to. And Rabbi Akiva ratified it. And Rav Yosef bar Minyumi said that Rav Nachman said, the law does not follow that pair, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan the cobbler, who said maybe you could do it with just 2 judges, maybe you could even do it with 2 judges if one of them is disqualified, depending on how we read what we just read. But Rav Nachman said the law doesn't follow these guys. No, you need 3 judges. Evidently, Rabbi bar Chiya relied on the individual opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who permitted chalitzah in private. And therefore, Shmuel commented regarding Rabbi bar Chiya's power to rule based on an individual's opinion. And if you wish, say that not only does this detail follow an individual opinion, but rather all of these details are taught by an individual opinion. As it is taught in a baraisa, Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, said, I saw that Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha performed the chalitzah using a slipper in private and at night. So the same set of circumstances in which Rabbi bar Chiya performed the chalitzah and ratified it, so also did Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. So it seems like under certain circumstances it's going to be possible. It was taught in the Mishnah that if chalitzah was performed using his left foot, her chalitzah is invalid, while Rabbi Elazar says it's valid. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for the majority opinion, the rabbis? Ula said, we derive a verbal analogy from the word foot stated here and the word foot stated regarding the mitzorah, the one with saras. Just as there with respect to the mitzorah, it is the right foot, you see in Leviticus 14:14, so too here with respect to chalitzah, it is the right foot that must be used. This is presumably when he's done being a mitzorah and he comes to do the purification ceremony, which involves him bringing offerings to the temple and then being anointed by a priest in certain locations on his body, including his right toe, so the toe of his foot. And here they mean the right foot. And so they're going to learn out from that just as in the purification of the mitzorah, so too in the case of chalitzah, when it says foot, we mean the right foot. So the Gemara notes, and this would seem to indicate that Rabbi Elazar does not derive foot with regard to chalitzah from the word foot from the mitzorah. But isn't it taught in a baraisa? Rabbi Elazar says, from where is it derived? That piercing a Hebrew slave's ear with an awl, A-W-L, when the slave chooses to remain in servitude, right? Person who, when a Hebrew is enslaved by another, when a Jew is enslaved by another Jew, and we no longer have slavery, but when we did thousands of years ago, it would only be for a period of 6 years. But if he chose to remain a slave because he liked his master, and he liked the wife that his master gave him, and he just prefers to be a slave, back then, like you could get a decent setup as a slave, nice apartment, nice living, retirement plan, etc. Just called slavery, and it is slavery. But some people chose to remain in it. And when they did, there was a ceremony performed for that, where their master took them to a door frame and they put their ear on a door frame and basically got it pierced on the frame. Like they had a hole made, like a nail, create a little hole in the ear, but it was done on a door frame. I don't think they put an earring in it afterward, but it was a painful little ceremony, quick, that signified that this person wants to be a slave forever. People chose to do that. The Torah had a provision for people who made that choice, and people did. So, there, when it refers to doing that with your ear, the Torah specifies the right ear. And so perhaps when you're doing a ceremony involving a body part, and the body part is not specified right or left, we're going to assume it is the right based on the ceremony of the slave who chooses to remain a slave. So Rabbi Elazar implies that he does, in servitude is done specifically on the right ear. Ear is stated here in the laws pertaining to a pierced slave, and ear is stated there in the laws of the mitzorah. He also gets anointed on the ear, just as he does on the toe, when he does his purification at the end of his period of being a mitzorah, when he brings offerings so that he can be purified. So just as there, with regard to the mitzorah, it is the right ear, as it is stated explicitly there, so too here, with regard to piercing the ear, it is the right ear. Okay, so the mitzorah passage says this happens on the right ear. The slave having his ear pierced, it just says shall put his ear on the door. And we learn out from the passage of the mitzorah that the pierced slave must use his right ear. When we get to that law, we'll see, what if they did the left ear? Does he still remain a slave or does he not? That's a question we'll ask then. But the point is that the optimum proper way is that it's done on the right ear for the slave, and we learn that from the case of the mitzorah. Right ear. Now, this statement of Rabbi Elazar implies that he does learn a verbal analogy about the word right. He extends that it's the right ear from the case of the mitzorah to the pierced slave. So, are we going to extend likewise that it's the right foot in the case of the mitzorah, and therefore in chalitzah, it's the right foot that must have the shoe removed? Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef said that Rabbi Yochanan said the attribution of the opinions is reversed, meaning that it is Rabbi Elazar who invalidates chalitzah on the left foot, as he learns an analogy from the law with regard to piercing the ear that the right must be used. That kind of makes sense. So it would have been that in our Mishnah, the rabbis are lenient in both cases. The chalitzah can be performed at night. It can be performed on the left foot. And Rabbi Elazar is stringent in both cases. It cannot be performed at night, and it cannot be performed on the left foot. Perhaps that is how the Mishnah should have been worded, and there was a misprint in the Mishnah. Rava said, no. No. Actually, do not reverse the opinions of the Mishnah. The words ear and ear are free terms. i.e. they are superfluous in their context, and therefore it is clear that the Torah included those terms for the express purpose of establishing the verbal analogy. A verbal analogy that is based on otherwise extraneous terms cannot be logically refuted. Therefore, the superfluous ear teaches that piercing is done on the right ear. However, the words foot and foot are not free to make this kind of an interpretation and a connection from the Metzora to chalitzah. Why? Because the word foot, written with regard to chalitzah, when it pertains to the Yavam, is necessary in its context. It is not superfluous. Therefore, the verbal analogy of the word foot to connect it to the Metzora, it's not available. The word foot on the side of chalitzah is not available to make that connection because the word foot already is teaching various lessons about the fact that the shoe needs to be on his foot and the guy has to have a foot, or at least the bone that connects to a foot, and several other teachings like that. So we can't learn out that it needs to be the right foot. And therefore, that's why the rabbis would validate or seemingly invalidate the right foot. No, that's why you would validate the right. No. That's why you can't say it has to be the right foot based on the Metzora, and therefore it should be valid on either foot, right? And that, in that case, seems like Rabbi Lazar would have a good point. So the Gemara asks, and even if they are not both free to be used for this exposition, well, maybe we don't need that exposition. We don't need that refutation. A verbal analogy that is free to be used for exposition in only one place can still be valid, provided that there is no reason to refute the comparison. So the Gemara explains, it can be refuted as the Metzora is unique in that it is a very specific process necessary for his purification. He requires that the blood of the offering that he brings be sprinkled upon him, and it has to be like on his ear and on his foot, I think one other location, and also he requires cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet thread to do the sprinkling. Therefore, it is possible to say that the Torah also specified the use of the right foot in the case of the Metzora. However, this would not necessarily be required with respect to chalitzah, which lacks such specific laws like what is being applied and how it's being applied. Consequently, chalitzah performed using the left foot could be valid. And that's where that discussion ends on Mishnah number 2. Mishnah number 3, and we're about to move into page 104b. Mishnah number 3. If she, the Yevama, the widow, removed the shoe and spat, meaning spit on the ground, and she spat in accordance with the law, but she did not recite the necessary text from the verse in the Torah that describes the chalitzah ceremony, which says what she must say out loud, then her chalitzah is valid. Right? She took the shoe, that's the main thing. She took the shoe from off his foot, and she spat, but she didn't recite the recital from the Torah. It's still a valid chalitzah. If she recited the text, and she spat, but she didn't remove the shoe, what do you think? The chalitzah is disqualified. Removing the shoe is the main thing. If she removed the shoe, and she recited the text, but she did not spit, that's the question we've really come to now. Rabbi Lazar says her chalitzah is no good, disqualified. Rabbi Akiva says her chalitzah is valid. Now, we only have 2 individual opinions, and we're not sure which is right. We don't have a majority opinion. We don't have an anonymous opinion. Rabbi Lazar said to Rabbi Akiva said it's okay, right, if she removed the shoe and recited the lines with the Torah, but she didn't spit. Rabbi Akiva says it's a good chalitzah, it's valid. It's not a good one. I mean, it would be better if she did all the steps, but it's still valid. Rabbi Lazar says not valid. So Rabbi Lazar says to Rabbi Akiva, the verse states, so shall it be done to the man who does not build his brother's house. The essence of Yibum. And they're declining to do it. This man is declining. She's declining too, but in the ceremony, he bears the brunt of the, public blame. The word so at the beginning, so shall it be done. This word so, right? So is an exclusionary term, right? Kacha, so is an exclusionary term indicating that only precisely in this fashion is chalitzah valid. The word so, it's not just so is done, it's just a term of speech. So is done meaning so, just like this. You must do all these steps or you didn't perform chalitzah. So is an exclusionary term indicating that only precisely in this fashion is chalitzah valid. Therefore, any term that constitutes an action for chalitzah is indispensable. Because the word so is at the beginning of this passage. If you leave out any of the elements, if you didn't take the shoe from off the foot, if you didn't spit in his presence, and you didn't recite the lines, if you didn't do all three, it's no good. Rabbi Lazar is making a very good argument. What does Rabbi Kiva answer? Rabbi Kiva said to him, you derive a proof from there? But it says, so shall it be done to the man, indicating that only a term constituting an action toward the man, namely any aspect of the chalitzah that concerns the man himself, his body, such as removal of his shoe. Only those things are indispensable. But spitting, which is not done to him, you spit in his presence, but you're not doing it to him. You don't spit at him. You don't spit on him. You only spit in his presence. So that's not something you're doing to him. And since the opening of the verse is, so shall it be done to the man, so then the spitting is not indispensable. The spitting is optional, according to Rabbi Akiva. But spitting, which does not involve the man, although it takes place in his presence, is not indispensable. And the Mishnah lists additional laws with regard to chalitzah. If a deaf-mute underwent chalitzah, or a deaf-mute woman performed chalitzah, or if an adult woman performs chalitzah with a male minor, her chalitzah is invalid, and the woman may not marry. She's not free to marry on the basis of that chalitzah. If a female minor perform chalitzah, she must perform chalitzah a second time once she becomes an adult, and if she does not perform the second chalitzah, her first chalitzah is invalid. If she performed chalitzah before 2 or 3 judges, and one of them is found to be a relative or disqualified as a judge for some other reason, her chalitzah is invalid. Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan the cobbler validate the chalitzah in this case. And an incident occurred involving a certain person who performed chalitzah between him and her alone in prison, not in the presence of others, and the case came before Akiva, and he validated it, right? So all those cases we just heard, they were referred to in the discussion of the previous Mishnah, and here that Mishnah is being stated for us. But as we see, it is a majority opinion that all these situations, it is an invalid chalitzah, and the woman after that ceremony, it's like she's done nothing, and she's still bound to her yavam, and she's not free to go marry someone else. Now, the one that right away sets us off, especially with the modern ear, is the chalitzah of a deaf mute is not a valid chalitzah. Now, they're talking about in ancient times, they didn't have the kind of, enabling that we have today for people who might be deaf or mute, but can, communicate many other ways. And we understand that, they're perfectly normal people. They just can't hear or speak. But back then, they didn't have a solid test for that. And it was possible that the reason the person couldn't hear or speak is because there was nothing going on upstairs, and it was a person, who was not competent to deal with his own affairs. And that's why, you wouldn't perform that chalitzah on them, as if because they might be unknowing that the chalitzah was performed. Today, it would be there would be a novelty in that question if we say, well, this person doesn't hear or speak, but they are 100% cognizant of what is going on in front of them and what this chalitzah means. Now, the problem with that is, but if they're deaf, right, then the recitation of the lines from the Torah is not something they could technically hear the Yevamos say. Or, if she is the deaf mute, it's not something that she could utter so that the Yavam could hear it. So is that somehow, are we going to have a workaround? Is there going to be, does she have a co-wife? Or is there another Yavam who is not deaf mute? Or if that's not an option, are the sages going to come in, appoint an agent, and make it possible so that they're going to be free from each other and they're not going to be, bound to each other for the rest of their lives? That's obviously not a possible outcome. They're not going to do that. So how are they going to deal with it is an interesting question. Okay, that was the Mishnah. Now we're moving down 104b, the Gemara. Rava said, now that you have said that the recitation of the Torah text is not indispensable in order for the chalitzah to be valid, right? And our Mishnah said it's the shoe being removed that matters, but if she removed the shoe and spat but didn't recite the text, it's still valid, right? So now you're saying, okay, well, the recitation of the text is not indispensable. You could do without it, really? So the Gemara is challenging that. And Rava said, now that you have said that the recitation of text is not indispensable in order for the chalitzah to be valid, well, then therefore, if a mute man or a mute woman perform chalitzah, their chalitzah is valid. Since the recitation of the text is not indispensable, what difference does it make if the man or woman is a mute? Although the statements should be recited ab initio, since according to your opinion, the recitation is not indispensable, so then mute individuals can perform chalitzah. But the Gemara challenges this. But we learned in the Mishnah above, if a deaf-mute man underwent chalitzah, or a deaf-mute woman performed chalitzah, or if a woman performs chalitzah with a male minor, her chalitzah is invalid. And what is the reason that the chalitzah is invalid? Is it not because these people are not competent to recite the text, thereby indicating that the recitation is necessary even after the fact, and therefore was not a valid chalitzah? But the Gemara rejects this assertion. No, the reason for disqualifying a deaf-mute man and a woman is because they are not considered to have intellectual capacity, and therefore their actions do not have halakhic significance. It's not that they didn't hear the recitation of the text, and that's why the chalitzah is not valid. It's that under ancient law, they're considered to be not legally competent, and as evidenced by the fact that they're deaf-mute, and therefore a chalitzah can't be performed on a person who's not legally competent to engage in that legal proceeding before a court of judges, which is what chalitzah is. So the Gemara asks, if that is so, well, then let us also say that a mute man and woman do not have intellectual capacity. Now, we've been talking about a deaf mute. Let's also say that a mute, just one who can hear but he can't speak, man or woman, they don't have intellectual capacity. How do we know they have intellectual capacity? They're not talking. So Rava said a mute man and a woman do have intellectual capacity. There's no evidence that because they can't speak but they can hear that they lack intellectual capacity. Rather, it is their mouth that hurts them, says Rava. Mute individuals have full intellectual capacity. They merely lack a means of expression. The deaf mute, on the other hand, is not considered to have the full mental capacity to be able to speak. Where you could see that in modern times, where they certainly can speak, because now we have sign language and all kinds of other means at their disposal, that presumption would be strongly challenged. Now, the Gemara challenges again, but didn't the scholars from the house of study of Rabbi Yanai say that a deaf-mute man and woman are disqualified from participation in chalitzah because, not that they lack intellectual capacity, but rather because they cannot fulfill the requirements spelled out in the Torah? He says, and she shall say, right? They have to actually recite text from the Torah, and not due to insufficient intellectual capacity. Rather, when that first statement of Rava was said, it was stated concerning the second clause, the latter clause of our Mishnah, where it said, if a deaf-mute man underwent chalitzah or a deaf-mute woman performed chalitzah, or if a woman performs chalitzah on a male minor, her chalitzah is invalid, right? Because, not a lack of intellectual capacity, but because they can't hear it. So Rava said, or they can't pronounce it. Rava said, you have now said that recitation is indispensable, right? If you're saying that the reason that a deaf mute cannot perform chalitzah is because they can't hear the recitation of the text, so then you have just contradicted the Mishnah, the seeming implication of our Mishnah that we began with, which was that recitation of the text is indispensable. You said it is indispensable, and the one who can't hear it can't perform chalitzah. But the Mishnah said that if she removed his shoe and spat in his presence, but didn't recite the text from the Torah, it is a valid chalitzah. So which is it? Is the recitation of the text indispensable to the ceremony or not indispensable to the ceremony? Right, so Rava said, you have now said that the recitation is indispensable, as can be inferred from the Mishnah disqualifying the deaf mute. Therefore, according to Rava, if a mute man or woman perform chalitzah, their chalitzah is invalid, right? Because they weren't able to say the words out loud. And the Mishnah, which indicates in its first clause that recitation is not indispensable, our Mishnah here, number 3 in chapter 12, says, no, it is not indispensable. You can do a valid chalitzah without the recitation of text. And the Mishnah, which indicates in its first clause that the recitation is not indispensable, but later states that chalitzah performed by someone incapable of recitation is not valid, so this must be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Zera. What? What are we talking about, Rabbi Zera? So somehow the Mishnah has to explain itself that the recitation of text is not indispensable, right? You can do without it, but if it's performed with a deaf mute, it's not a valid chalitzah. So the problem with the deaf mute cannot be that they can't hear the recitation of text, because you don't need the recitation of text. And we've already said it's not because they lack mental capacity. That would explain it, but they said no, we don't have any evidence that a mute lacks mental capacity. So there must be some other rationale which explains why you can have a valid chalitzah without the recitation of the text, and yet the deaf mute and the mute cannot, that their chalitzah is not valid. So what is it? It's the opinion of Rabbi Zera with regard to meal offerings. What does Rabbi Zera say about meal offerings? A meal offering is generally a mixture of flour and oil. If flour is added to the oil, but they are not mixed, they are considered to be fitting to be mixed, so long as there is not an excessive amount of flour, right? So when you bring a meal offering in the temple, you're going to bring a certain amount of flour mixed with oil, so it becomes dough, right? You're going to offer dough. It's dough that's being offered. But if you brought the flour and the oil, but you didn't mix them together, okay, it's still okay. You haven't disqualified yourself from bringing this meal offering because it is fitting to be mixed, even though it is not yet mixed. This is what Rabbi Zera said. Whatever is fitting to be mixed, mixing is not indispensable to it. And it is valid even if it is not mixed, right? So, since it's fitting to be mixed, since you could mix it, okay, maybe it would be more practical for the priests who are going to receive this offering to not have it mixed yet. It's going to keep, they have a big backup. They can't bring the meal offerings yet. They'd rather bring it a few hours from now when we get, when this particular offering gets to the head of the line. They're going to leave it unmixed. But the fact that it's there in the right amounts, the right amount of flour, the right amount of oil, it's fitting to be mixed. We don't have to mix it right now. Maybe it could even be brought on the altar, never having been mixed, and it would still be valid just because it could have been mixed. All right, that was enough. However, if you brought something that was totally out of whack, many sacks of flour and just one little vial of olive oil, so you didn't have what you needed to mix it properly. So this is not fitting to be mixed. You don't have the ingredients that you need to bring a proper meal offering. So here you would say, even though it's not mixed, just like the other one wasn't mixed, this is not a valid offering because it's not fitting to be mixed. When it's not fitting to be mixed, you could say that mixing is indispensable to it, because if you were to mix it, you wouldn't have what you needed, and therefore this fails as an offering. So what they're saying is, if you have what you need, it's good enough. You don't have to do the actual mixing. But if you don't have what you need, we're going to say that its mixing is indispensable, and that's why it's disqualified, because you don't have the elements that you need to do the mixing. They sent the following teaching from, and so likewise with the deaf mute, how does this apply? So an action becomes indispensable only if one is unfit or unable to perform it. So with regard to the recitation of the verses in the chalitzah, although it is not indispensable, right? But if you're talking about a person who's hearing abled and speech abled, so then the fact that they didn't do the recitation of verses is not going to disqualify it as long as the shoe was removed and the spitting was done, because they could have done the recitation of verses and they, for whatever reason they didn't. Maybe they're short of time. But if you're talking about a person who's incapable of doing the recitation of verses, then we'll say, well, the recitation of verses is indispensable in the sense that this person could never do the recitation of verses, and so we're going to say it is indispensable, and their chalitzah is not valid. They sent the following teaching from Eretz Yisrael, from the land of Israel, to the father of Shmuel. Once a Yevama, the widow, has done the spitting, once she has spat, she must perform a complete chalitzah and may not enter into yibum. right? So let's say it's a 3-part ceremony. Remove the shoe, spit, recite the verses. Maybe you could do it in different order. You could spit first. Once you have commenced that ceremony, even if all you did was spit, the spitting we saw, you could do the remove the shoe and recite the verses and not spit, and it's going to be a valid chalitzah. So it's not an essential component. But if you did do the spitting, you haven't completed chalitzah, but you have taken yibum off the table. They can no longer perform levirate marriage once she has done the spitting. They haven't completed the chalitzah, but they can no longer do yibum because they commenced the chalitzah ceremony. Once a Yevama has spat, she must perform a complete chalitzah and may not enter into yibum. And the Gemara comments, by inference, you may learn that even though the spitting did not permit her to marry outside the family, spitting by itself is not enough to create a chalitzah. Nevertheless, she is disqualified from entering into yibum with any of the brothers, and she must therefore now complete the chalitzah as her only option. The Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is this law? If we say it is in accordance with Rabbi Akiva, who stated in the Mishna that spitting is not required after the fact, you should do it, but if you didn't do it, it's still a valid chalitzah. Well, according to Rabbi Akiva, it is difficult, as the following Kal v'chomer reasoning indicates, an a fortiori argument. Now, if even in a case where there is a mitzvah of chalitzah and the Yevama is still around and capable of fulfilling the Torah command of spitting, and one might say that spitting should be treated just as it is with regard to the fatty portions of offerings that are consumed on the altar, where the law is that when they are not present for the offering, i.e. they were lost or became ritually impure, they are not considered indispensable to permit the consumption of the offering on the altar. When the fats of the offerings are no longer present for offering, it is permitted for the sacrificial meat to be eaten, the priestly portion, to be eaten by the priest through the sprinkling of blood alone, even without offering the fatty portions on the altar, right? When the temple was standing, somebody brought a sin offering. They brought this unblemished animal, it was slaughtered in the proper manner, and then it was disposed of sort of there were 3 elements of the offering on the altar. There was the blood that was sprinkled on the altar, there was the fatty portions that are burnt up on the altar, and there's the priestly portions that are given to the priests as sort of their payment for being priests, where they would eat that meaty part that's given to the priests. And if the fatty part that's supposed to be burned on the offering was lost or became impure, became disqualified, and they somehow had to get rid of it, would they throw away the meat that the priests are supposed to eat because the fatty portion that was meant for the altar, for God's mouth as it were, never made it there? Or can we say that, well, as long as they did the sprinkling of the blood on the altar, the fact that the fatty portions were disqualified does not disqualify the priestly portion? Likewise, we're going to say, by analogy, if the spitting was not done, but the rest of the chalitzah was done, the rest of the chalitzah is not disqualified by the lack of spitting. It must be that Rabbi Akiva holds that way for chalitzah, the way we hold for the fatty portions of sin offerings. So Rabbi Akiva said in the Mishnah that spitting is not indispensable to chalitzah, even in such a case, and the chalitzah is validated by the removal of the shoe alone. Since Rabbi Akiva seems to accord little significance to the spitting, he cannot be the basis for this law, as if spitting is never indispensable, could spitting alone disqualify her from entering into levirate marriage with one of the brothers? You would think that if spitting is a dispensable aspect of the chalitzah ceremony, then just the fact that she did this one thing, spitting, is it really now going to say now she can no longer change her mind, she can't go back and actually perform yibum with one of the other brothers? Why? If it's such a, small aspect of the chalitzah ceremony. But rather, one might say that this teaching is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Lazar, because Rabbi Lazar disagrees with Rabbi Akiva, and he states that in the Mishnah that spitting is indispensable for validating chalitzah, and it is necessary alongside removal of the shoe. Since he accords significance to the spitting, one might have thought that the teaching prohibiting the Yevama from yibum with the brothers once she has spat is in accordance with him, with Rabbi Lazar. But this is difficult as well, as, according to Rabbi Lazar, removal of the shoe and spitting are both necessary. And therefore, they are considered 2 permitting factors that must be completed in order to fulfill an obligation. And there is a principle accepted by Rabbi Lazar with regard to offerings that should be applicable here. Whenever there are 2 permitting factors that are indispensable for an offering to be valid, one of those factors cannot elevate one of the subordinate components of the offering to consecrated status without the other. So you would think that if you need two actions done to make this offering fit to go on to the next level of the offering process, so you need both steps or the offering cannot move forward. Similarly, since Rabbi Elazar holds that chalitzah and spitting, that removal of the shoe and spitting are both indispensable, if she performs only one of these actions, such as spitting, it is only one of two permitting factors and therefore should not disqualify her from yibum with one of the other Yevamim. The fact that she only spat should not disqualify her from marrying one of the other brothers because she hasn't performed chalitzah yet. So rather, this teaching that just doing the spitting disqualifies her from doing yibum, one must say that this teaching is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe. And I'm very close to done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. So this is in accordance with Rebbe. So why would Rebbe say that once she has spit, she can no longer perform yibum? He is of the opinion that even one of two permitting factors can affect a change in status without performance of the other factor. As it is taught in a baraisa, the lambs sacrificed on the festival assembly, what's that? We just had it. That was Shavuos. Consecrate the loaves that accompany them only by means of their slaughter on Shavuos. There are special offerings brought on behalf of the nation of Israel, right? We have Passover in the spring, then we count 7 weeks, and then it's Shavuos, when we celebrate Matan Torah, the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. We celebrate that on the 6th of Sivan. We're now on the 19th of Sivan, the 20th of Sivan. So on Shavuos, when the temple was standing, there were two main things that were done on that day as the ceremonies of the day. There were special offerings brought, the lambs, right? So animal sacrifices brought on the altar. And there were the 2 loaves of bread, the 2 consecrated loaves of wheat bread, as opposed to the barley loaves that were brought on the second day of Passover. And so that's why we always say that the 7 weeks of counting the Omer, going from Passover to Shavuos, is a time of purification, purifying the soul, where we sort of rise from eating animal food like barley, because we're animal-like, to eating human food like wheat bread, because we've refined our character and our soul. So, can the priests who eat the loaves of bread on Shavuos eat those loaves if the lambs have not been slaughtered properly? Do those 2 offerings go together, or if something went wrong with the lambs, can they still eat the loaves? Right, so Rebbe is of the opinion that even one of 2 permitting factors can affect a change in status without performance of the other, as it is taught in a baraisa. The lambs sacrificed on Shavuos consecrate the loaves that accompany them only by means of their slaughter, as the slaughtering of the lambs consecrates the bread. Until the lambs are slaughtered, you cannot eat the bread. How so? If one slaughtered the lambs for their own sake, i.e. as lambs for Shavuos, and then the priests sprinkled their blood for their own sake on the altar, then the loaves are consecrated. However, if one slaughtered them not for their own sake, like you brought the lambs as an offering on Shavuos, but you didn't know that you were doing it for Shavuos. It was a daily offering, and it was the same animal being offering that you would offer on Shavuos, but you weren't thinking of offering it for Shavuos, so that intent invalidates that slaughter. You didn't bring the lambs of Shavuos. So if one slaughtered them not for their own sake, and the priests sprinkled their blood for their own sake. They slaughtered it, they weren't thinking that it was Shavuos offering. But when the priest brought the blood to sprinkle it on the altar, he was thinking this is for the Shavuos sprinkling. Then the loaves are not consecrated because he didn't have the correct intent when he slaughtered the lambs and when he sprinkled the blood. The fact that both things weren't done with the correct intent invalidates the lambs and means that the bread is not consecrated and the priest cannot eat the bread. As the factors indispensable in rendering the offering valid were not properly performed. If one slaughtered them for their own sake, and he sprinkled their blood not for their own sake, the fact that the lambs were properly slaughtered renders the loaves partially consecrated. Therefore, the loaves are consecrated to the extent that they cannot be redeemed, but they are not consecrated to the extent that they may be eaten. They've been affected. They've now risen to a level of consecration that they can't be sold out of. They're going to have to be retired, as it were. but because they didn't also sprinkle the blood on the altar properly, they didn't rise to the level of being edible by the priests as the offering, the bread offering of Shavuos. And this is the statement of Rebbe. So according to Rebbe, if you didn't do both elements, you didn't consecrate the bread fully, but you did do something to the bread in that it couldn't be redeemed. So are we going to learn from that Rebbe, I guess so that's why according to Rebbe, it's possible that the spitting without removal of the shoe or reciting the verses is going to change her status, so she can't perform Yibum anymore, even though she didn't complete the chalitzah. She's not free to go marry other people, but no longer can she marry any of the surviving brothers, her Yevamim, because of the spitting. It was a partial procedure that changed her status partially, as Rebbe ruled in terms of when the blood was not sprinkled properly on Shavuos with regard to the loaves of Shavuos. All right, that's what we have for today. Let's check questions or comments. Oh, I beg your pardon, Sharon, that earlier I talked about your husband. I was confused. It was your father-in-law that we dedicated our learning to him today. I beg your pardon for misspeaking. Could you pass me his name? What is his name that we dedicated our learning to today? Just put in the comments. I think Nina might have had to go out, but pass me that in the comments, and I'd like to say his name, your father-in-law, who died 53 years ago, and we're dedicating our learning to his memory today. I know there's a delay, so that'll come in a little bit. Okay. Oops. Bill, wait a moment. Does it mean that a deaf-mute woman is incapable of performing chalitzah and therefore has no choice but to marry the Yavam? No, right? That can't be the outcome. I know that's not the outcome. So the question is, if her chalitzah is invalid and there's no other woman to perform it, and she wants to perform chalitzah with the Yavam, so one out might be that in modern times, we know she has mental capacity because she can communicate despite the deaf-mute disability. And a different out might be that they appoint an agent for her to hear it on her behalf. She appoints an agent so that she can, hear it through the agent. I'm not sure exactly how they deal with it. Maybe we'll come to it in these last couple weeks of pages. But no, they're not going to make her stuck. I know that. Okay, we're dedicating our learning today to Natan ben Avraham Halevi. May his memory always be for a blessing, and may our learning today accrue to his merit in Shemayim and take him even higher in the world of souls. Say amen. And finally, Sharon, I had the same reaction as Bill on a related question, the amputee and the disfigured leg, and the response was similar. Okay, so Nina had to go. That's all we've got time for. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday night, 6 p.m. Pacific. I thought this was an exciting page, and I'm really, if you're joining us for the first time and you found this really confusing, let me know. Put in the comments or message us. But I've tried to make it, as accessible as possible to somebody who tuned in for the first time. And for those who've been in the class every night, going on 900 episodes, or maybe you didn't make them all, but you made a lot. I hope that, you're in this flow now. And we can move at this speed and at this level and sort of accessing the logic of the sages. Obviously, it's very difficult to just hear it and follow everything that's being said, but our class is just operating at a much higher level now. And so Yasher Koach to everyone in the class. May you be strengthened to keep learning and keep raising your level. If people think it's moving too fast or too high level, let us know. And we'll see if we need to make any adjustments. Have a great night, a good week, a good Vach, a Shavua Tov, and I'll see you with God's help tomorrow night, Monday night, 6 p.m. Pacific.